Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Welcome back to the Re-Education of Schools podcast. Again, we're on episode 6. Then you got to breathe, regulate before you educate. I feel like you should be the one to say that. I feel like that's going to flow off your tongue better than me. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But yeah, so we're going to be talking today a little bit about regulation. Again, kind of starting off these first good handful of episodes, talking about a little bit more broad topics that are kind of foundational, I think, to everything that we're going to talk about moving forward in probably more nuanced ways. So don't take this as like the end all of everything with regulation, but we do want people to have a good sense of what regulation is and what that means before we're, episode 27, talking about it in a more nuanced way, right?
Yeah, I can't believe we're at episode 6 already.
I know. Just think when we're at episode 27 and I'm referencing it back. Yeah. I'll be like, remember that time I said episode 27?
Can you loop that back? And Josh? Okay, good.
Yeah, he'll put that in there.
Okay.
Or he'll cut this out. It doesn't matter. Either way. All right, so we're going to be talking about regulation. Let's jump into it. So kind of the first basic question is, what is regulation?
Yeah, and I think next to relationships, regulation's the second most important foundational thing we're going to talk about for the entire podcast. And those two things will come up over and over and over again. So regulation is just keeping your body in that rhythmic state, the steadiness, your breathing, your heart rate, keeping your nervous system calm. It's how our body responds to stress. So, but it can kind of go, the biology about it is two different things. So you're going to have a hyperarousal response is what people can do. And that could be more jumpy, agitated, explosive part of regulation. But we also can be
like hyperactive almost.
Hyperactive,
like that same, hyper. Okay.
Yeah, and then
in case people don't know prefixes.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's also hypoarousal, which is like depressed, withdrawn, frozen, which is also part of our regulation system. And it kind of goes back to, we'll get into this more in another episode, but the polyvagal theory, right? So your nervous system kind of helps dictate your regulation. So those down times when you're in your dorsal vagal, the depressed, withdrawn, frozen state, and then your hyperarousal and your sympathetic nervous system, where you're just kind of your automatic stress response. So that's kind of like the science behind the regulation piece. But it starts from birth. So
even kind of pre-birth, really.
Yeah. So you have your baby, you're in utero, the fluid, the heartbeat. I mean, this is how babies, when they're developing, that they're used to being in that rhythmic sense with the mother. And then after birth, babies cry because all their regulations gone. They're dysregulated.
Everything that kept them calm and felt safe is now shattered.
It's gone. So then what do? We pick up babies, we hold babies, we rock babies, we put them next to our heartbeat. That's that co-regulation piece, which I know we're going to talk about more, but that's the piece that helps babies. We have to teach them and be with them for that regulation piece, especially in that early development.
Yeah. I think that was a great description. I think for me, it's in looking at a classroom or looking at, your home or whatever, it's when things seem good, right?
Yeah.
Like things seem good, things seem calm. There's nothing like really crazy going on. The kids aren't, wild. They're not asleep.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, it's a sweet spot where like learning, you expect that learning would be able to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
And you can feel the regulation in a space. You can sense when your classroom feels dysregulated, and you can also sense when your home seems a little out of rhythm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
probably because you're going to feel, as an adult, you're going to feel that as well. You're going to end up feeling whatever that dysregulation is. And we tend to pass that on to each other as people, right? Mm-hmm. And so that makes it that you can usually gauge things by how you feel. Like there are frequent times where I'll come into the building, and this is like a practice I've tried to like implement in myself every day because I'm so great. But is this idea of like reading the building and the feel of adults before any kids even get there. And I usually, not with like 100% accuracy, but it's amazing that if you're like purposefully paying attention, how accurately you can predict if it's going to be a kind of a wild feeling day in the building as a whole, or if it's going to feel like a really low key day. just by like paying attention to like how all the staff seem to be right, right from when you walk in. Super
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, I think we kind of experienced that this week. I was dysregulated this week because
Imagine why, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah,
Full
but
week.
we've talked through that. Like I talked to other teachers and they're like, yeah, it was the staff was we were all kind of feeding like the normal calm and steadiness.
Yeah.
Wasn't there, and the kids, and so our responses were a little maybe bigger than they needed to be because it was the dysregulated, not the scenarios, because we're usually pretty steady and calm, but it was the adults or the feeling in the building was just a little amped up that day for some reason. And I felt like our responses were where I went home and really reflected and thought, I was off today.
Yeah, that could have been lower key. That was actually a lot lower key than what
I think
felt like in the moment.
Yeah, I think we maybe over responded almost in some occasions because of our dysregulation as adults in some magnitude. So it's good to be self-reflective on that too. And I think even classroom management, we say, well, the kids are really good today, or I've got really good classroom management. It really is, you're really good at keeping regulation in your classroom. Management has nothing to do with behavior systems. It's the regulation of your classroom.
Yeah, and imagine like any given year then, if you have students who are naturally in a more regulated spot themselves, they have a lot of steady things that keep them regulated in life, your room is going to seem like it's a really easy year or like it was a really great year or whatever. And like then the years that maybe you have a good handful of students that aren't in nearly the regulated spot, I guess, or have family or life situations that make their ability to regulate that much harder. Those are the years that you're like, oh my gosh, I feel like so much of my effort goes towards classroom management. And really what we're saying is like it's going towards regulating the class.
And keeping and you may even feel as an educator, this year's been so stressful. Teaching's been hard this year. It's probably because you've been dysregulated for good portions of the year, and you felt more in that dysregulated state than you have in that green, ready to go learn state. So then it feels like it's been really unsteady for you or you feel tired and exhausted, is because you're trying to be the model of regulation for your students, and it's taking a lot more effort out of you to do that than it is to just go ahead and teach that lesson.
Yeah, because you're having to provide that instead of just going, right?
Yeah, and so the kids with trauma responses, I think we should talk back to maybe the A study, episode 2. Kids with trauma responses, they've not had co-regulation, or a lot of it, or have even learned self-regulation yet. So their nervous system, it's a trauma response for them, and that's why they're usually chronically dysregulated or have regulation issues, right? Yeah. So I think that's good to point out that this does go back to a physical response, like we talked about with trauma, that not all kids that are dysregulated, that's not always the case, but that could be an impact in your classroom too.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And I think that then it's, again, that's kind of a biological thing as opposed to, just a choice that a kid's making or whatever. And again, we could delve like real deep into this. I don't think we have time for that in this episode, maybe at some point, but not today. Then we end up kind of assuming that kids are doing stuff on purpose, or that like they're positioning themselves like real against us. And the reality is that they're probably just in a spot, and maybe they've never learned regardless of age, right? You've got high schoolers out there and you've got adults walking around that have no idea how to keep themselves regulated and require other people to be there to help them regulate. But if we're not doing that, and if we're assuming this is like just a choice that somebody's making, then we're going to approach that very differently than if we, realize that, hey, this kid just needs help. Yeah,
I think it's really apparent just watching. You watch the news, or a TikTok, there's a lot of dysregulated people walking around that are now is being caught on film, right? So I think that's 100% true that we as a society don't focus on or haven't embedded yet in education regular regulation practices in our classroom. And so here we are. That's why we're talking about it today.
So then how do we teach that? Like, because we're saying like, oh, we need to, like, even long term, looking at adults, for our society to continue to function, we probably should be teaching kids how to be regulated and the skills to be able to do that. But how do we do that? How do we teach kids that?
Yeah, I think it first starts off by modeling. I think us being regulated adults is a great model for, I think we know the science says we're mirror beings.
Yeah.
So if you're regulated, someone will catch your calm. I think it's developing the vocabulary for kids. I think it's teaching kids beyond the like I feel sad, mad, angry, whatever. We need to develop additional vocabulary for kids and teach them where they're feeling those sensations in their body.
Yeah.
Like you can start feeling triggers within yourself and teaching kids. If you're starting to feel that tingliness in your forearms, you might be feeling anxious, or that might be your signal for angry. Or if your chest feels heavy or your stomach feels a certain way, that's because you're hungry. So getting kids to start feeling those sensations and being aware, but we're rushing them so much that we don't have time to be present to actually feel whatever our body's feeling to be able to appropriately respond. So I think slowing down a little bit is the other part.
Yeah, and I think we tend to be so surface level with some of those things if we're with younger grades because we don't think they can handle it. And then as kids get older, we assume they know it. And so then we miss actually explicitly teaching. Because I think like teaching on like purposefully teaching, some of these things in a like lesson kind of way is necessary. I don't think we can just, expect that kids are going to pick it up, so that explicit teaching is good. I think there's tons of like kind of SEL kind of curriculum, social emotional learning curriculum out there that districts have and companies are selling. It seems like everybody's selling
something.
That's like the new thing, right? Like start selling SEL curriculum. And that actually leads us, we are selling an SEL. No, we're not. That's not the case.
Yeah.
But I think that it's okay to use those things. Those aren't bad. It's not bad to take the time. It's actually really necessary to probably take the time to purposefully teach kids, especially when they're young, some of this stuff. But I think to continue that on, because there are a bunch of kids that are going to have missed that, even though they're a middle schooler, even though they're a high schooler. I think there's value in that, don't you?
Well, I think it's anything we teach. I think this has been a year where it's really clicked with me. You could teach something once, just like kids.
Yeah.
Kids and adults both, you have to go back and reteach when people are ready to hear it, when kids are ready to hear it. Some people need more teaching than others. Some of those kids need a tier 2 or tier 3 explicit instruction and modeling because they need that more repetitive practice. Adults would be the same. Everybody. So I think it's good to have common vocabulary, and we have to start embedding regulation practices in our classroom as a normal base. Yeah. We start our day. We have either it's a focus attention practice or just a break, or having a regulation space in our classroom, and normalize that regulation is a part of our daily rhythm in our classrooms.
Yeah.
In our school.
Yeah, and I think that's good. And I think, when we have those kids that do get dysregulated, because everybody's going to, right? All of us get dysregulated
throughout the entire day.
Yeah, off and on all day long. So when we have that, I think one of the important things that maybe we sometimes don't do is always circle back around, because we get worried, I think, sometimes about igniting whatever was done. Oh, it's finished, so now I don't want to talk about it again, because if we talk about it again, the kid might get amped back, or they might cry again, or they might whatever, like, let's just move on. And I think when we circle back around and point out, like, hey, I know you were feeling really bad, I want to point out that you then went and got a drink, and that helped you stop crying, or like, hey, then we went on a walk, or hey, we then used this heavy book that we picked up. You were really excited. You felt like you had all this energy. And then we, did this activity that helped get some of that energy out, and it helped you feel better. Like, to circle back and point those things out, I think is helpful to kids, because then it's not just also a curriculum that we're teaching, but it's more like, oh, I just did that. Like, and that might be a thing that helps me later.
Yeah, I think it's because each child's going to be different. So I think one thing that I think we see sometimes is everybody's going to get up and we're going to do this great go noodle, and we're going to have a dance party in the classroom, and everybody sit down and we're going to be ready to go. Yeah. Sometimes that hyperactivity is not the regulation practice that all kids need. And then you're spending time getting them back down, some of them, not all of them, back down to a regulated state. So I think you just have to be careful about, like, well, I did this, like
a one-size-fits-all
regulation practice. I think it's really important for our kids to figure out what works for them and allow space and time where that's normal in your classroom. So if a kid needs to go walking is a great rhythmic activity. Going to get a drink of water. Some kids... And I think it's just another dangerous thing. We give everybody a fidget, right? And then it's like, what is going on? Why no one's listening because everyone's playing with their fidget?
Everybody's mad. Yeah, then everybody's mad because we're like, now we're taking them away.
Yeah. So I think the one size fits all is really tricky. I think teaching kids how to use the tools, talking through those things, and then modeling yourself those regulation practices are are really good. We've put like a reset room or reset area out in our lobby, just a table. Coloring is a great regulation activity. So like kids, allow them to come and color. There is some sensory items. Soft music is another great thing. Letting kids just listen to music while they're working, like that. Like there's some coffee house type music. There's why people go to a coffee house to do work. There's some research behind that because of the rhythmic, like just background noise. That's good for some kids.
Yeah.
So allowing them to listen to that kind of stuff while they're working or while you have work going on in your classroom is great.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And I think some of those, again, some of that rhythm stuff, like whether it's like walking, whether it is color, those things, and even talking through with kids, like situations while you're doing that. Like there's also a lot of studies out there to show like kids are way more likely to talk and can access parts of their brain to be able to actually have language to go with like what was just happening when they're in those rhythmic states. And if they match like your walking rhythm and speed, like that does a whole nother thing too with like how they're able to actually connect with you as a person and open up and things like that. And I think a lot of times as teachers, we're in our room at a desk.
Yeah.
Sitting with kids and saying like, now let's talk about this. And you've got this poor kid like fidgeting around, or kids get in trouble and they go to an office and they sit when maybe they could go for a walk with whoever to talk about what just happened, Yeah.
And then you're regulating. So our goal should be, right,
Yes.
if we want to correct the unproportionate discipline or disproportionate identification of students, we've got to get kids regulated back into tier 1 core instruction. So if our goal is to remove kids, we're missing tier 1 core instruction. We've got to regulate and get them back into class. And we can't really reason with kids, and kids can't really learn until we are regulated.
Yeah. And so talk about like what a disruption to that is if you are constantly sending a kid out because they've been, disruptive or whatever. And then they're out and that's disrupting everything. So now they're dysregulating and then they come back in, but that's dysregulating and it's dysregulating to other kids in your class. It can be a very, really a dysregulating practice overall. Okay. So we can talk about like that idea that we have to teach this to kids. But like, what is the payoff there? Like, what is the impact on learning by having us actually teach these kids? Like, why spend the time doing it?
Your whole classroom environment will change if you embed regulation practices. This is the one thing I feel like if anybody walks away from our podcast listening to, if you embed the relationship practices, 100%, but the regulation practices, that is a normal, natural, and prioritized time and space in your classroom, your tier 1 instruction will be so strong because kids are ready to learn in that prefrontal cortex and receive what you're telling them. But we have to set up a classroom environment where regulation is a normal embedded practice. And it starts with like the lighting in your classroom, your voice and tone, you taking care of yourself, which I know we'll talk about, allowing kids for walking. You're not in trouble. The kid that usually asks you to use the bathroom 5 times in your class, they need to regulate. They really don't need to use the bathroom. Yeah. It's not about that. They're trying to get,
not,
yeah, hopefully not. That's one other issue to talk to their parents about. But like they really are just trying to get out to go get themselves regulated. We all do these things in meetings. I will click a pen repeatedly.
Yep.
Like if I'm nervous in a meeting that I know I have to go present or with people I'm not my stable, trusted circle. Yeah. I will take a pen with a cap on it on purpose just for regulation for myself. So think about some of those things that you put into your classroom and allowing and prioritizing. It doesn't go without boundaries. I think this is where sometimes, they're like kids are just sitting.
It's not the Wild West.
Kids are just sitting, laying all over tables, or like we all have fidgets, and it's like, because then that seems wild. That's not regulation.
Everybody just brings in their sleeping bag every day. Like, wait, what? Like, that seems like
that seems crazy. Yeah, there has to be some kids also like structure, routine, and boundaries, right? So how can you embed both? And I think when you find classrooms that have that magic, then that's really where we see a lot of really strong tier 1 instruction. And sometimes when you're in a classroom with 25, 28 kids, sometimes your environment can help set the tone for regulation. So if you go back to making your classroom look more like a home environment and that calming, it already sets the tone that we're more low-key in the classroom.
Did you feel like that's why my classroom's so low-key? Because of the hominess that it has? You should flash a picture up of my classroom right now. Don't do that,
There's
Josh.
nothing on the walls.
Katie may have described it as looking bare and like a prison. But But yeah, that's just kind of my
But the
style.
regulation in the classroom is so strong,
Yeah,
though.
different setup. Different setup.
Yeah.
Okay, so I keep thinking about that, like with that whole impact on learning. It's really, to me, a lot of it comes down to trading quantity for quality. And I think if we're willing to make that trade, if we're willing to understand that I don't just have to do something 100% of the time, that we don't have to have like nonstop activity. And we kind of alluded to this earlier at the top of the show. Like you don't have to just go all the time in your class. And I think that sometimes we use that as almost a classroom, like a classroom management strategy. Like, and I think I did for a while, like early on in teaching. Like if I have them just nonstop working, then they can't do something bad. Like,
Yeah.
right? Which I mean, kind of makes sense, but then we end up just overworking kids. Plus we end up making a ton of work for ourselves. Cause then all of a sudden we're like, when I have imposed this idea that I've got to grade all this stuff that they just did, when that's not really the case. And then I'm working nonstop, trying to make sure all of them are working nonstop. And I think if we take the time to understand that, hey, there's actually like a worthwhileness in this regulation and spending time regulating, then we can have times that are, and this is probably something you would speak to a lot more than me even, but then we would have times where kids could engage in learning that isn't directed by me. You know, the teacher isn't the one directing the learning then, like in a stand up in front and lecture kind of way. But instead, they're able to like go and learn with each other because we have them in a regulated space. If they're all dysregulated, that would be a nightmare. Like if they're all, you know, in their own stations and kind of doing their own thing with each other, like that would be really hard if the whole class is dysregulated. But I think we win over, like we get deeper learning that occurs if we keep students regulated and we actually make less work for ourselves, but it also benefits the students more. It's crazy that we're not doing that all more, I think.
Yeah, I think you really are speaking to the work that John Hattie. I just got to see him last week.
I was just thinking about the work of
John Hattie. I know. I feel like should I get it like a ding above my head every time I mention somebody's name?
Maybe I should know way more people. That's what I always think. I'm like, why don't I know these people?
So I think this goes back to the work of John Hattie, the self-efficacy in terms of student feeling empowered and knowing that they can have control over their learning. And so one thing he really spoke on was we need to give kids direct instructions. They need to have explicit,
Sure.
this is what it is. But you've got to pair it with more project-based learning or student-centered learning and that process-oriented learning. It has to be both. So if your classroom is direct all the time, you probably have a lot of dysregulated kids. And kids are not taking ownership or really understand. If you think about Bloom's taxonomy in terms of them actually being able to teach whatever they are learning, that's where we see the biggest impact for learning. And that's, I know in the state of Ohio, our rubric is calling for student-centered learning. So get kids take ownership of their learning. I think we get so hung up in what you just said, that product stuff. Teachers need to switch over to process-oriented work and getting depth of learning. Kids really knowing a deep foundational understanding of those standards and what they're supposed to learn. Then to say, well, they covered all the stuff. We did 26 packets this year, and I have no idea why my class is a mess right now.
Yeah.
It's because we have to go back to that environment where the community is established. Because when we start talking about discipline and restoring, you have to have that community ownership.
Yeah. And I think so much of this has to go back to, because I mean, you have to either be willing as a teacher then to, if your district school principal, whatever, seems to push the, you know, you have to be working all the time, you know, keep moving. What are you doing? You know, like, but I think teachers a lot of times put that on themselves. But if that's not the case, if it is being put on you by like some above you entity, I think you have to be willing to either speak to this and why it's not the best way to go, and why, you know, spending less time like focusing on quantity of work and more time on quality of work and depth of work and how that is learning and regulation, like why that's important and why science kind of backs that up. But then I think you also just have to take some of the pressure off yourself, which is easier said than done. So that's one of the things I would want people to hear is that you probably, hopefully, don't have somebody just looking over your shoulder 100% of the time. Take some of that pressure off yourself and allow yourself to relax a little, be regulated, and maybe approach things in a different way, and watch how your whole class just kind of is able to take a deep breath and just be.
You can set the tone.
Yeah. Like that. It doesn't have to just be like, and now the next thing all the time.
Yeah, and I just heard a great presentation by Michael McKnight, um, where he was talking about our not letting our students even be present or understand the environment around them because we are constantly pushing our adult agenda and our stress responses. We're getting really heightened stress responses for kids right now. You think about anxiety, depression, kids just really
all
being
like through the roof.
all
Yeah.
through the roof right now. Teacher burnout. It's all because we're moving. Our stress response systems are completely activated all the time because we are not getting a moment to pause and like kind of take the rhythm of the classroom and listening to the rhythm of your classroom. Each class is going to be different in what kids need and the pace in which they can work at. So you got to listen to your rhythm and then plan around that within that classroom environment.
Yeah.
And just letting the kids be noticing their own, that they can't regulate themselves. We never give them time to understand what their body's feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not built. Humans aren't built to go nonstop. I mean, that's why we kind of disassociate like at various times. You probably stop paying attention during this podcast, already at various times. And that's fine. That's part of how we even learn and re-engage. Like we'll stop and we'll kind of take a breath and then we'll go back and re-engage. Think about any training you've ever been in. You're not like honed in for 2.5 hours just listening to somebody. Like it's not how we'll end up writing stuff down. We end up doodling. We end up getting up and leaving, going to the bathroom. Like that's not going to be any different for kids. Okay, we kind of started talking about this already, but how does this impact us as adults then?
I think this is the thing that I'm probably most concerned about as like a school administrator is that the teacher burnout and stress level, because I feel like teachers they're burnt out right now. I think there's a lot of pressure on them through the things we just talked about, and we need to start prioritizing taking care of our teachers. And part of it's listening to them. I feel like the amount of time that we're asking them to, like, you have to do 80 minutes of this or whatever it's set up in your district, be like giving some space in the schedule for like a morning meeting, a soft start, an intentional exit to your day.
Yeah.
We're so scheduled all the time that I feel like teachers also need to have time where we prioritize co-regulation with others, giving time to process, allowing some time to put in those self-regulation practices within your building, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, there are going to be teachers out there right now, and then there are going to be administrators out there right now. Administrators at any given level are going to be like, yeah, we say that all the time. Teachers need to take care of themselves. And then the teachers are going to be sitting, in their car or wherever you like to listen to our podcast. And they're going to be saying, oh yeah, people are great about saying it. But like, then the reality is, again, they want me to do 7 hours of instruction in 6.5 hours of the day. And that doesn't count lunch or the recesses or my planning period or
talking through
else.
Student behavior.
Yeah. Yep. Like none of that's even included. How do you think, and this is a bigger problem than I guess, or really, I don't know if it's worth asking this question. I think it's good. Maybe I'll make a statement instead. I think it's good to start thinking through how that looks for real versus just saying it because it's the thing we're supposed to say. So whether you're a teacher, how does that look for real in your classroom? Start thinking that through. Or if you're an administrator, how can I provide that for my building? I think that's good to start thinking through. And then if I'm somebody super high up, I'm running the show as a superintendent, listening to this, how do I lead the way in showing and, purposefully making it known that this is actually important, that we don't need to go 100% of the time, and that we're worse off educationally, even with the curriculum, even with our test scores, we're worse off for it. So we have to figure out what that balance is. So those are important things to be thinking through. We don't have time to solve that today. I just keep thinking too that, for us, it takes a little bit of pressure off as a teacher. If a kid is dysregulated, that I don't have to my job isn't to end the dysregulation. But I think we feel that sometimes. I have to end this. I have to make this be done. Right now. I have to finish it because everybody's uncomfortable with it. You don't necessarily have to do that. You don't have to find a way to end it. And that's where I think we end up kicking kids out all the time. I couldn't end it. I couldn't I couldn't punish it out of them. So now they just get out of my room. We actually don't have that pressure. We just have the pressure of being with them in those moments. And I think if we live in the spot that we were just talking about, where we don't put so much pressure on ourselves to keep doing the next thing, you have more time to do that than what maybe it feels like right now. You know, you don't have to always be go, 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 go. If you've got a bunch of kids doing different things, you know, in different centers of your room and it's very much student driven, then you actually have time to sit down with a kid for 5 minutes and help them regulate, hopefully.
Yeah, and the best thing you do to regulate a kid is just to co-regulate with them.
Yeah.
We are designed for co-regulation. We seek it out all the time. You go sit next to somebody who is a steady, calm person for you, like a really good friend, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's another kid. Sometimes I seek kids out. I'm like, hey, let's go do whatever, because they like a little happy. You think your kids are like your happy spot, right? So I think just sitting next to a kid and listening, you don't always have to fix the problem.
Yeah.
To regulate a kid, just sitting quietly and waiting for them to start talking to you is the quickest way. Because when we start talking at kids or solving the problem when they're dysregulated, we're just causing a longer duration of dysregulation.
Yeah.
So I think that's the most powerful thing you can do.
Yeah, and I think it helps us avoid those power struggles then too, right? Because then we're not trying to convince them, and then when they're not getting regulated and we're not convincing them, now we're getting upset, now they're getting upset, now we're like trying to, you know, figure out who's going to win that kind of tug of war. I think it helps us avoid that, which is good too.
Yeah, and kids throughout the day, we don't want to teach kids never to be dysregulated.
Sure, yeah, you're
so
going
I
to be
think that's a
dysregulated.
misconception. Like people are like, well, you should always be in green zone all day long.
Yeah, that's not realistic.
That's not how it looks. Our goal is to teach tools that the kids find strategies that work for them and ourselves, and that it's okay to be dysregulated. The goal is for you to learn how to self-regulation or seek out co-regulation in order to get yourself back.
Yeah.
That's going to happen throughout the day for all humans.
Yeah. Yeah, you're doing that too, right? We're doing that as adults. All right. Kind of at the end already. There's so much more to talk about.
Oh, yeah. This is a deep one.
Yeah.
We actually teach a 3.5-hour course just on this.
Yeah.
So here we go.
So there,
in 30
there
minutes.
was 30 minutes.
30 minutes, yeah.
You got hopefully some highlights. All right. So what do we want to have people walk away knowing?
I think learning, if you want kids to learn and you want to improve test scores, we have to teach and prioritize regulation. So if we want that's just science, it's research, you can't argue it, that this has to be prioritized and taught within districts, because that's just how the nervous system works. For kids to be in that prefrontal cortex and really absorb and learn everything, we have to have regulated teachers, and we also have to have kids that are regulated, which starts with embedding those regulation practices within our classroom and figuring out what each one of our kids' needs are so that our classroom is in a more regulated state. So start thinking about your classroom management instead of behavior management, or maybe like the way PBIS thinks about it for us. Start thinking about it as my class is regulated or dysregulated, or a kid is dysregulated, and then your lens shift will happen about how to create that regulation so that we actually can learn. And that's just how it works.
Yeah. Not what punishment I need to dole out or what discipline that kid needs, but how can I help them regulate? Yeah, that's a big shift. I was just thinking like dysregulated students can't learn and dysregulated adults can't teach.
Yeah.
Those are two truths that are out there. And so the best way to regulate kids is to be regulated ourselves. So take time to do that. That's hard it's again, like I get fussy when people tell me to do that, but like I think it's one of the things that's super important to really take your time to figure out what for you personally helps you stay regulated. And who are the people that you're interacting with in the building? Are they really regulated people, or do you tend to like lean towards people that are like running real high all the time? And if that's who you're always hanging out with, staff wise, maybe adjust that a little bit and either be by yourself, that would even be better, or seek out people who you're like, that person's always kind of calm and low key. Find those kind of people and help yourself be regulated. Because again, we co-regulate with each other. So do that for each other. And then you got to do whatever you can to help keep yourself regulated overall. And you can't do that if you are just burnt out because you're working so hard all the time and you're never turning off. You've got to find ways to turn off and do something that's relaxing, because you'll never be able to teach kids if you're dysregulated, and kids will never learn when they're dysregulated, and they're going to be dysregulated if you're dysregulated.
Yeah, it's the whole loop, right?
Yeah.
And I would say as like a building culture and climate, if you have a lot of dysregulated people in your building, because dysregulation also is toxic and it's contagious.
Yeah. Yes.
So a bunch of dysregulated adults could kill the culture and climate in a building. And I think that's why we have to prioritize school culture and climate of having more regulated adults, because the calm is contagious as well.
Yeah.
So we need to seek and feed that into our buildings that will build school culture and climate more than anything.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you as always
Yeah.
for coming and being with us. Man, it goes so fast. But we appreciate you coming and taking time just to be with us and listen, and also to join in the conversation. Hopefully, if you have questions or you have comments, we have ways for you to reach out to us in emails.
Email, Facebook page.
Yeah. Definitely leave those things,
Yeah.
ask us questions, give us feedback. We love that already. We've gotten stuff from you guys, and it helps us change and be better, hopefully, is always the goal. So ask questions. Again, if there's ways or topics that you want us to talk about or would love for us to address, go ahead and let us know, because we would love to hear, as we go through this general stuff, what are specific things you want to hear us talk about, right? And not that we have all the answers. Again, we never want to paint that picture.
Definitely not. But I think it's part of starting the conversation, right? If we don't talk about it, there will never ever be change, right? So it's good to start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys for being a part of that conversation. And now let's go out and do the work.
Let's do it.